Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the Pork Queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady, and it's a busy week in Iowa. We have Halloween, we have Beggars Night, we have politics and election season, and so we're just going to talk about all of it at the same exact time, which sounds crazy, but we're going to do it through the historical lens. Was Iowa always purple? It's red now. It's been purple. What colors has Iowa been in the past? And of course, if you didn't figure it out, Caitlin Clark, Des Moines and Iowa made national news when Caitlin Clark was talking about Beggars Night, and people were like, what is Beggars Night? What is that? A lot of Iowans don't realize that Beggars Night isn't actually a thing, really hardly anywhere, but here and maybe a few other areas. So we're going to get into all of that with Leo Landis, the state curator of the State Historical Society of Iowa and the museum curator of the State Historical Museum of Iowa. Do you like how I remember that?
That was great, Justin. Good work on that.
Because you've been in here before.
I have. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you back. Sorry, it's a little warm in the studio today.
Feels fine.
We're going to sweat it out today. We both have our water, though, so we're going to be good. So let's start with Beggars Night and move into politics. And we're not going to tell you who to vote for. We're not going to do any of that. Strictly historical lens, fun stuff for everybody. Just, so.
Yep, good Iowa history that a lot of folks may not know.
Yeah, I don't want people like tensing up thinking, are they going to talk about Trump? Are they going to talk about it? No, we're not. Nope, we're not going to do that. That's another show. So what help me understand this is Beggars Night is basically a thing in Iowa. More specifically, it started in Des Moines?
It didn't really start in Des Moines. It was a nationwide effort, and it wasn't like major, but places all over the U.S. in the 1920s and 1930s, and most historians think it was connected to the economic upheavals of the 1920s, and especially in rural areas. We think of the Depression starting in 1929 with the crash. Well, there was economic depression starting in rural America even before the crash. So you've got a period of cultural upheaval and economic upheaval in the 1920s, and then even more so in the 1930s. And one of the manifestations is that around Halloween, a lot of teens and adolescents like to do bordering on dangerous pranks, like leaving boulders in roads. And I am not making that up. Like rolling rocks into the middle of a road was seen as a good Halloween prank.
Of course. I mean, who doesn't do that?
Right. Whereas more minor things, and just to give a reference, so we think of Beggars Night really taking hold in Des Moines about 1940. There had been some smaller efforts, but Fort Madison, so in the southeast part of the state, they have Beggars Night underway, which is trick-or-treating on the 30th, not the 31st.
What? Really? Okay.
So that if children are out on the 30th or young adults, teens, they're out trick-or-treating. But on Halloween, if they're out, they're probably up to some kind of mischief. So it's a way to monitor children and young adults from letting the air out of car tires, pulling down fences, turning over. A lot of people had outdoor plumbing, so turning over privies or outhouses, putting them on their side. So this was a common occurrence. The 1938 Des Moines police report about 500. 1938, about 500 incidents of vandalism of one sort or another.
That's epic.
Yeah.
So I think, everybody thinks of like kids these days and all the stuff kids these days do. This is dating back to 1938. This is an old thing.
Right. And it was 1920s, 1930s. So minor acts of, again, vandalism or violence taking place around Halloween. So let's create this new thing called Beggars Night, where we encourage children to trick or treat. And in fact, one of the Des Moines Tribune, I think the afternoon paper headlines was, "Don't say soap or eat. Treats, soap or treats," because you'd take a bar of soap and like soap somebody's car window.
What?
As a point of mischief. And so it's like, no, it's trick or treat now, folks. And so it's really a way to make the trick or treating experience more wholesome and more socially good, as opposed to causing mischief and violence.
So why didn't it catch on nationally then?
Well,
Because
it did in some ways. So like in Boston, or excuse me, in parts of Buffalo, New York, there's a community on the south side of Buffalo, New York that still has it. I was telling my wife, who's from Ames, I was like, actually, Ames had Beggars Night at least until 1975. I found that reference where Ames had trick-or-treating on October 30th. So it did. It's just it persisted in Des Moines, and it, like in Story County, I can't remember if it's Gilbert or Story City, while Ames had it on the 30th. Either Gilbert or Story City had it on the 31st, so those children could double dip. It's like, we're gonna be in Ames on the 30th, and we'll trick or treat in our hometown the night after. So
they could double dip. That's brilliant. We get everybody up there in Gilbert and Ames is thinking, let's bring that back. Guys. Let's bring back the double dipping, the double Beggars Night. So basically, it's a matter of in Des Moines specifically, it stuck around for a lot longer than everybody else. But it's still distant enough where most people don't even recognize it. Like there's all these reporters that were reacting to Caitlin Clark's comments, even ones who live around here that are like, wait, what is, like newer ones that are like, what is this thing?
It's probably the most asked question, at least top 5 I get asked as a Iowa historian is, what's up with Des Moines and Beggars Night? I've done seriously.
No, wait, just during the season or overall?
It's usually in October. Yeah,
you gotta be kidding me.
I've probably in my 11 years done 3 or 4 stories connected to Beggars Night and just had other inquiries around it.
That's hysterical.
Yeah. So talk to the Washington Post. Talk to the Washington Post. One of their Europe-based reporters who was looking for some fun news had seen the report. So I'll have a quote or two in a Washington Post article.
And that's coming out here pretty soon.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. We'll make sure to link that by the time this. Well, we'll probably beat him. I think we'll beat him. I used to write for the Washington Post.
Oh, so excellent!
It'll be nice to beat him at something.
There you go. Yeah, yours will drop before theirs.
Yes, that's right. Story of my life: beating the Washington. Why? Like, how big did it actually get? This wasn't a thing that was in like every state and every town at one point, was it?
No. It really was in towns that were looking at. Usually there was some kind of advocate who wanted to reduce the level of mischief, and you had to have some kind of troublesome, youth element. That really was, and Des Moines apparently did. I mean, when you see, around 500 incidents of vandalism taking place. So a woman named Catherine Krieg, who was Des Moines City Parks superintendent, she is hired around 1935. She starts having workshops in the mid-30s on how to have a appropriate and socially responsible Halloween experience. And then in 1940 gets 15 city leaders, both public and private, to sign on to the idea of Beggars Night. And so there's references to Beggars Night in Des Moines, and it was like in serious. So, again, try to put yourself back in 1938. It's still the Great Depression.
Like just yesterday.
Yeah, it's still the Great Depression. A lot of Iowans are having a rough time. And so there were children who would maybe trick or treat a couple days before that, and again, threaten minor violence to people, like, we're going to soap your car windows if you don't give us some kind of apple or, a snack of some sort. And so she's trying to rein in this, 3 or 4 nights of door knocking around Halloween. And seriously, the new 1940 paper talks about neighborhoods of Des Moines having children door knocking, or young adolescents door knocking multiple nights around Halloween. So it's like, okay,
that's funny.
We're going to put it on October 30th. Yeah. But again, it's a really tight time economically. So if you were a young person and your family may not have had a lot of food, why not go knocking on doors and begging for a treat?
I mean, Des Moines is a really rough town, as you know, and Iowa in general, just really rough. And so it makes perfect sense why it stuck around here for so long. It's just such a rough place.
Yeah, I love to talk to people about how rough Des Moines is. And I know it's all a matter of perspective. I am a Central Iowa native. I can say I'm a Des Moines native because I was born at Mercy Hospital. But I've lived in some larger Midwestern cities too, the Detroit area. Yeah. Indianapolis, had to drive.
And you come here and you're like, whoa.
Well, and again, I grew up here, so I'm used to 235. But I had a woman who taught me in kindergarten who, when I took the job from Salisbury House in 2013 to work at the State Historical Building, she's like, oh, you've got the Des Moines commute. And I used to drive I-94 outside of Detroit, 30 miles going in and coming out. And it's like, I think I can handle 35th Street where I live to East 6. I think I'm okay with that.
I live on the east side, so people in Iowa, are, when I talk about the east side, people are like, "Oh," I tell people like it's not actually that big of a deal. You just get up in the morning, you shiv your neighbor in the gut, and then you go to work. It's not a big. And they're like looking at me. Like,
of course, we know we're joking about this, but
East side's beautiful. I love it's giant trees everywhere. Anyway,
but the perspective is for many Iowans that Des Moines is a big place, maybe a little more dangerous than their hometown. Nevertheless, it's still Des Moines, and it's not.
We've got it good here in this state.
We do.
No kidding.
We have a great community, a great state.
So how often has it been? Obviously, we're speaking on Beggars Night. It's been moved because of the severe weather. It's actually raining right now. You came over here a little bit drenched because our studio is like very, very close to the Historical Society. So it's been moved. How often does it get moved? Is this a very rare occurrence?
So I started trick-or-treating in central Iowa probably around 1970.
Mm-hmm.
I left the state for a few years. I don't ever really remember Beggars Night being shifted. There may have been one or two nights, but
rare.
And I've seen a few stories saying for the first time ever, trick or treating, and it's like no, it's not the first time ever. But because again, in those 1920s, 30s era, children were trick-or-treating on multiple nights, not just Beggars Night.
Well, I was going to say, like, when we were kids, I don't remember it getting moved. I mean, we were going out and doing Beggars Night when it was, like, snowing and blizzard conditions.
Right.
You know, we'd leave with a group of 10 children, 8 would come back.
Yeah, you'd walk up the hill both ways. Yeah, to get your
Sounding
treats.
like my grandparents.
Yeah.
So was the joke thing? That's another thing that everyone got stuck on. Was that always a thing, or did that evolve? And why jokes? And again, are we the only ones who do that?
We are. When I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, our first year in 1997, in October, and children came to the door, and I'm like, "Okay, what's your joke?" And my wife was like, "They're not going to tell you a joke." So
people just thought you were a real creep.
Yeah, that really is something that came out of what Catherine Krieg was promoting. Was children like at Hubble Elementary were doing little musical skits, practicing musical skits before trick-or-treating on Beggars Night. So there was this idea that children trick-or-treating in Des Moines, part of that wholesome ideal was that you were going to give some kind of performance or a joke or just, but not going to be mischievous. It was a night of fun and good behavior. So well-behaved children was the goal, and having you do something productive to amuse your host. And then your host, might have a little game for you to play too. So there are stories of like a woman making children sign ledgers to say they visited her house in order to get a treat. So and maybe walking through a spooky place.
That's hysterical.
I have a sister who used to love doing her own kind of little haunted lead up to her house and then scaring children as they came up to her door. So I know some Des Moines folks do things like that still.
I gotta know, like, was there really a spike of crime around Halloween? Is that a real thing, or is this just this like folklore that's evolved over time? Because when I was a kid, which was late 80s, when I was born 83, and I remember the concern was like black cats were being stolen off the street and gutted and strung up on fence posts, and bring your pets inside because they're going to get stolen. And that's what I remember, the not rocks in streets or tipping over outhouses or digging up plumbing, right? So is it always kind of was it always this thing that inspired the hooligans to come out, or was it mostly just folklore and fake?
That 1920s, 30 period, there really was, a spike in misbehavior around Halloween. Okay. So that part is true.
At least it was real then.
I think there's been, recently, and by recently I mean in your lifetime, in my lifetime, which to people younger than us are like, well, the 80s, that was last century or last millennia. Would say that's a long time ago too, but there was that kind of hysteria around Satanism. And again, understand if you have a strong Christian faith tradition that you hear a story, you might say, well, I heard from a friend that such and such's cat was taken away. Or there is kind of that folklore and the kind of creepy stories that make you feel a little weirded out that become more common around ghost stories around Halloween. So I think in the more recent past, last 40 years, it really has been not so much as crime, though. Again, Detroit, just slightly before moving there in the 1990s, was still having issues with arson on Halloween night and that
Arson?
concept. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
As Detroit was being depopulated, there was an element in Detroit. And I love Detroit. It gets, a lot of, it's a city that's rebounded marvelously. I still get back there. But just it had a really bad reputation in the 80s, 90s. And so there was a spike usually in Detroit of arson incidents on
Do you see
Halloween.
that? I mean, you're a historian. You look backwards, but history repeats itself. So you're an expert on the future, believe it or not, right? Is that how that works?
I am not an expert on the future, but I'll tell you what when I think about this, I really do think culturally and socially we've changed in such a way to say, you know what, those incidents of vandalism really are not socially appropriate. It's not to the benefit of our community to engage in this sort of mischief. I mean, when I was a kid in the 1970s, the kind of story that you heard was that, be mindful of your pumpkins because you're going to have somebody who
gets
just
smashed.
Yep. And so I don't think I've seen smashed pumpkins, in the last 40 years.
Yeah, except for the band.
Yeah, right.
Do you foresee this being discontinued eventually, or is just this kind of fun Des Moines / Iowa tradition? There's like a city in Ohio, I think, that does it too. A couple random cities. Do you see this just stopping eventually, or in pure Iowa fashion, or we're going to be like, no, you know what? We like being just a little weird. We're going to keep it going.
I think it makes us distinct as Central Iowans to keep it going, but
kind of a little weird.
I certainly understand parents' perspective and pressuring, city leaders to say, we don't want to send our kids out on a school night. So does it make sense to shift Beggars Night away from October 30th and doing it on a Saturday night or something like that? I think it would not shock me if that happened.
I think the real reason is the kids do Beggars Night and then adults can do a party on Halloween itself. I think that's the real reason. Let's all be honest.
Right. There you go. So I do. I think I think it would be a shame for Des Moines to lose that tradition. I think when you understand the history and, the uniqueness, it's a good reason to keep it, but also understand people want convenience in their life. But by gosh, I took my son out on Beggars Night all through the early 2000s. Well, through the 2010s, everybody else can take their children out. It's gonna
be an epic Beggars Night because we're gonna have all the politics costumes. There are gonna be people dressing up as presidential candidates. There are gonna be people dressing up as former presidents. We and political figures. We all know that's gonna happen, right? So. Because we have this crazy merging of Halloween, Beggars Night, and politics. So that takes us to we used to be a purple state not too long ago, and we're considered a red state right now because the last election was a complete total swoop. I think Auditor Rob Sand, who's been on this show, we love him here, is the lone Democrat in office right now. And so the red state thing is kind of recent. We were a purple state. How many times have we switched colors in the past?
Well, you could say really from 1856 to 1932, we were a red state.
Really?
So
Dates back that far. Wow.
A huge run of being a red state. The saying amongst political scientists and historians who are old like me would be, Iowa will go Democrat when hell goes Methodist. And that really
I guess
is.
hell went Methodist.
Well, it goes Democrat. So in 1932, apparently, hell finally. I think there was a quote from some Iowa politician saying, "Oh, I guess hell is now gone Methodist."
That is funny.
And part of that is we're a state that comes into the Union right before the Civil War. There's this emergent party, the Republican Party, founded in Wisconsin in 1854. So in 1856, when James Fremont runs as the Republican nominee, and then you got James Buchanan as the Democrat. Republicans win Iowa in 1856. Then you've got another campaign in 1860 where there's this guy, Abe Lincoln, the first real Midwesterner running for, and Douglas too as a Midwesterner. Mm-hmm. So you've got Lincoln, Douglas, and some third-party candidates out there. And the thing I love to talk about as a historian, and we'll talk about the 1892 election, I think, as well, but up until that 1892 election, when you were a male going to vote, and until 1868 in Iowa, it was a white male, on a presidential election and statewide election, you'd say, give me the Democratic ticket, give me the Republican ticket. It was not a joint ballot.
What?
People knew how you were voting when you went to the polling place.
No way. When was this?
From our statehood until
Really?
1892. 1892 is when Iowa passes in most states what gets called the blanket ballot. So I love that story. When you come to the historical building in our civics exhibit, we've got examples of some of the 1860 ballot, one Lincoln for the Republicans and one Douglas on the Democratic.
You have examples at the Historical Society.
Yeah,
oh, that's
and
cool.
a couple are on display right now. And then we've got some others from Republican and Democratic campaigns, both statewide and national campaigns as well. So the last time you would go to a presidential campaign and ask for a political ticket for a specific party, that was 1888. 1892, we go to a joint or blanket ballot, the ballot we know today.
And that, because I know that there was, again, I don't remember this either, but I know that we had an option at the top of the ballot added, or maybe it was removed. I don't remember. Shame on me, but it was something like just straight ticket. You could vote all party.
I think it was till 2012, 2016. You could do a straight ticket in Iowa. 2016.
And was that removed? It's removed now, right?
Yeah, and that's been an.
So that's not a new thing.
No,
that's like actually you're saying back before 1892, you went into the booth and you had to have a Republican ticket
you didn't
or a
go
Democrat
to a booth.
ticket.
You went to a ballot box.
Sure.
Booths don't come around until really.
So were all the candidates on like the Democrat Republican ticket? You got that ticket and then you just go through the candidates?
Yeah.
Like if you wanted to vote for a Democrat,
you could scratch out a name.
You could.
Yeah, you could scratch out a name if you wanted to.
What the heck?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to vote for like a Republican and then a Democrat for certain issues, you'd have to take two tickets, or
no, you would scratch. You'd take the one that you were going to vote the most for, and say
stick with your side.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you wanted to, and most people did vote a straight ticket. So the idea was, if you wanted, for some reason, wanted to be a Democrat who wanted to write in a Republican, or a Republican who wanted to write in a Democrat, you would scratch off, say,
that is funny.
Say you were supporting James, you lived in Southern Iowa, James B. Weaver, who'd been a lifetime lifetime of his time in Iowa had been a Republican. He joins a third party called the Greenback Party. So you may not ask for a Greenback ticket. You'd ask for a Republican ticket, most likely, or maybe a Democratic ticket. But when you were writing in Southern Iowa who you wanted to vote for U.S. representative, you would have crossed out that name and written in James B. Weaver. And so James B. Weaver is a really important Iowa politician. He gets nominated for president in 1880 by a group called the Greenback Party. He was elected to the U.S. House out of Iowa as a third-party candidate. So that's kind of one of those fun stories, just James B. Weaver in general.
Was that like a third party kind of a situation back then, or was it a major party?
Oh, it was a third. The Republicans and Democrats were the dominant parties.
Got it.
But in the Midwest and the West, there were a group of politicians who wanted to maintain the monetary policy of printing paper money, hence greenback.
Oh, got it.
Yeah. And so they wanted to keep larger amounts of money in circulation. They weren't ready to leave the gold standard, but wanted to have paper money have wider circulation than just, gold coinage. So he was a Greenback Party candidate. There was enough support for him in Iowa that he wins election to the U.S. House as a Greenback candidate. He wasn't running as a Republican. He wasn't running as a Democrat. And then that national party, and it's more of a regional, because in more industrial eastern states, they didn't care about them. So he doesn't get any electoral votes. But the story I love just to share with Iowans about James B. Weaver. So the evolution of those Greenbackers is to industry, people who support labor, and people who support rural Americans join to create a party called the People's Party. They're commonly known as the Populists. James B. Weaver in 1892 gets the presidential nomination for the Populists, and he is a big enough deal that he's the first Iowan to earn electoral votes in a presidential election. So
he's the first.
James B. Weaver, before Hoover runs and gets, the presidency in 28, James B. Weaver earned 22 electoral votes. He had Kansas, Nevada, Colorado, I think part of Oregon. He also had, and I'm checking my notes, so Kansas, Colorado, Idaho.
By the way, Is this the first time you've checked your notes this whole time?
It is.
That's crazy. People can see the video. This is nuts.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So he gets 22 electoral votes, Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, North Dakota, Nevada, and then part of Oregon. Oregon, I think, had 4 electoral votes, maybe 5, and he got 1 of them. So they were much like Nebraska today, where the electoral votes didn't follow the whole state in 1892 in Oregon. They went by congressional district, and so he got 1 of those Oregon votes. So 22 electoral votes, 1892, James B. Weaver. So if you're ever in a trivia competition that says, who is the first Iowan to get electoral votes? James B. Weaver.
There's another, you mentioned Hoover. Who other, like, as far as like Iowans holding executive office, it's a kind of a short list, right? Like really high office.
Really, if you're just talking, the executive branch and not cabinet level, you've got Weaver getting votes in that 1892 election. There's actually a black man who was living in Ottumwa named George Taylor, who actually gets nominated by a real third party, not well regarded. He doesn't make the Iowa ballot. I've seen, whoever was the gentleman who was leading his Iowa campaign apologizing for not getting him on the Iowa ballot and that nomination. So George Taylor out of Ottumwa was at least nationally known as a black man running for president. I think that was 92, might have been 96, maybe 1900. I should have his story.
And you're saying 1892, so people are like 92. What the 1892 people.
Yep. Yeah, 1892. So that's a really compelling story. He doesn't get any electoral votes. Then of course, Herbert Hoover, has a illustrious career through what they called the Great War, helping feed Europe, works as Secretary of Commerce in the Harding and Coolidge administrations, and then gets the nomination in 1928. And so, major story there with Iowa's first and only native son being elected president. So most of us know that story. And then, of course, as we were talking beforehand, just saying, that 1932 election is really compelling. We are in an economic depression. The Wallace family of Iowa, there was 3 Henry Wallaces. There was one known as Uncle Henry. He was the grandfather who brings the Wallaces to Iowa. There was Henry C. Wallace, who was a Secretary of Agriculture, who was a professor, was the word I was trying to say, a professor at Iowa State. So that's Henry Cantwell Wallace. And he had a farm out by Greenfield in the town of Orient, and they had a son named Henry A. Wallace, and they were a stalwart Iowa Republican Party family. They were part of the progressive movement in the 1890s, early 1900s into the 19-teens, so that part of the Republican wing. But then, as the Depression's getting deeper, Franklin Roosevelt, looking for somebody to join his administration from an agricultural standpoint, puts Henry A. Wallace in, and I realized I misspoke in my notes too. He doesn't run as vice president. First, he's the Secretary of Agriculture.
Oh, okay.
So he gets nominated to be Secretary of Agriculture, so he doesn't run against Hoover in 1932 as a vice presidential candidate. I think that was Garner on the FDR ticket. And then in the 1940 election, you've got Wallace being the vice president. And so Wallace, really gives us our first vice presidential candidate. He runs as a third-party candidate in 1948 after Truman's running as the Democrat had got the role as vice presidential candidate in 44. I'm talking about Harry Truman. That's a whole nother story, that 48 campaign where you've got Wallace running as the Progressive Party candidate, and Harry Truman really relaunches his bid as a presidential candidate in Iowa. He is seen as going to get trumped by the Republican candidate Dewey. And so that's the 48 campaign is the whole Dewey defeats Truman, Chicago Tribune headline. But to relaunch his campaign in September of 1948, Harry Truman does this barnstorm that starts out in Iowa on a train, goes from Johnson County, Oxford, and Iowa City, ends up in Dexter, at the National Plowing Championship, which was a big rural event, and gives a speech and just re-energizes his campaign in Iowa. So the Harry Truman whistle stop campaign of 48 that reinvigorates his campaign starts in Iowa.
That's crazy. I didn't know that.
Some great stories connected to political history in our state.
Last couple seconds here. I know that you're doing stuff for Veterans Day. Can you plug that briefly? Because that's coming up next week. But yeah, what are you doing at Veterans Day? We'll have to keep that short. Maybe we'll have you back to discuss that as well.
So this year, I should have warned you, we're being pretty low key on Veterans Day. I know we'll commemorate some of our Iowa veterans through social media. We've at times, and we may still set up one of the things that happened through the Historical Society, or what was then known in Des Moines as the Historical Department after what, again, was the Great War, World War I, was the curator at the time, Edgar Harlan, knew just how catastrophic that war had been. We lost over 4,000 Iowans. The official federal number is around 3,000 and some, but the state of Iowa counted men who were serving in foreign forces. So this is, just a story quickly to work in. We do have a spreadsheet of all the Iowans who died in service in World War I. So if you have an ancestor who died in service, not everybody who served, but who died in service, we probably have a photograph of them.
Really?
Because
wow.
Of almost all 4,000. There's just a small amount that we don't have photos of, because that was a commitment from what was then called the Historical Department under Edgar Harlan to collect photos. So we have the nurses who died in service. There's really some compelling stories. We know Merle Hayes' story as Iowans a lot of times, if you follow history, as one of the first 4 American soldiers to die in service. There were actually Iowa men who died in Canadian and British and Scottish forces before Merle Hay was killed. It's just they weren't in U.S. forces. So they die pre-November of 1917. They die 1915, 1916. So if you're looking for a real deep history on World War I soldiers, and then we've got some great collections connected to Iowa's Civil War veterans as well. Our colleagues at the Iowa Gold Star Military Museum up at Camp Dodge will certainly have some really rich programming too. So
you can see historical items and memorabilia and medals and stuff like that on Veterans Day.
Yep. And they'll have some programming too, I'm pretty sure. Right, this year ours will mostly be virtual.
Very cool. People can swing by the State Historical Society though, right, and see stuff.
They can. Our Civil War exhibit is still, just a really fabulous exhibit. Two of my predecessors, Jack Lufkin and Michael Smith, did that exhibit in 2012. So if you want to understand Iowa's role in the Civil War, we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 4:30 on weekdays, 9 to 3 on Saturday. Great place. We're free.
I know.
So tough to beat.
You got a lot of stuff. Leo Landis, the state curator of the State Historical Society of Iowa and museum curator at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. It is always so fun to have you in here. I like it. My brain hurts now. So thanks so much for coming on the Iowa podcast.
It's always a treat, Justin.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa podcast.